for Friday, the 11th of August. I'm Stephen Ridgway. Dell Credentials bug has opened up VMware environments to take over, which sounds horrendous, but well, in fact, it is horrendous if you happen to be running the combination of tools that are susceptible to this. But basically, Dell compellent storage arrays appear to have a static private key in code on them, which is extractable if you know what you're doing. This basically then would give an attacker the ability to access VMware hosts that were sitting on top of this particular storage. So the risk is limited by the fact that only about 1% of the data storage market appears to be on Dell compellent equipment, and the equipment reached end of life in 2019. So, one would hope that that you have either replaced these devices or have a rolling program to get these devices replaced. In the meantime, I do believe that Dell are at least considering maintaining patches for some of this stuff. It's not that old, I suppose. But if you want to know more about this, the vulnerability is CVE 2023-39250, and yeah, the impact is high if you happen to be running VMware using Dell compellent storage. We discussed recently an increase in the focus on operating systems other than Windows for exploits. There's an interesting article in Info Security magazine that I came across today, which talks about the quality of the malware that's being written. Historically, there's been a perception that Apple devices are kind of hardened out of the box, and historically, that's there has been some truth in that. There's been very little in the way of malware that's been written for them in the past, but that is changing now. I think as a consequence of it being somewhat harder to write good malware for, effective malware for Macs, what there is out there tends to be more effective than a lot of the rather poorly written malware that floats around in the Windows world. So the common Trojan families targeting MacOS, for example, in 2022, so last year, Evil Quest, Generic Trojan, Exploit Flashback, and Empire. Now, some of these you would consider, or we would probably consider them to be legacy malware. However, they're still very effective because there is a reluctance for owners of Apple devices to apply software or operating system updates. It's unclear why that may be the case. I think part of it may be down to a feeling that everything works okay, so why do I need to? Off the back of, if you work in a Windows world, you apply security patches because, well, if you don't apply security patches, you're going to get a virus or you're going to get hacked or something's going to happen. Whereas historically, I think people running Apple devices have been of the opinion that it doesn't really matter. So I'll apply the patches or do the upgrades as and when it suits me, but I don't really want the thing to change, so I'll leave it alone because it's all okay. Well, that I don't think is the case anymore. I don't think that's a reasonable approach anymore. There is also a I think Apple is open to some fair criticism that it's very unclear about its end of life um, dates for certain for its operating systems, at least. Um, I know that it's generally understood that Apple will support current plus up to current -2, definitely current -1, but they don't announce we will stop providing updates after such and such a date for this version, which in some to some extent that leaves them that leaves them open to backport significant patches if need be, which they do occasionally, but it wouldn't stop them from doing that anyway, even if they'd announced an end of life. So um, something else which if you run a MacBook or whatever, you'd be surprised how functional older kit actually is. You can be quite merrily working on 10-year-old kit um, if you are comfortable with the fact that at some point over the last few years, OS updates have stopped happening. So if you look at that again through an average PC lens, it isn't impossible to run Windows or other operating systems on 10-year-old kit, but it's much less likely because generally the things are ground to a halt by then. Software has become bloated and or stopped working. And things have moved forward. So there's this reluctance to patch. So I think if you are, or if you look after devices that are Apple devices, MacBooks, whatever they may be, iPhones, you name it, there's a lot of overlap in the background. Keeping up to date with patching is the most important thing that you can do in order to avoid falling for these these older but very effective pieces of malware. Now, I came across another article. Well, I came across an article in the Register appearing to have identified a generic weakness in client VPN services. It's been written up as tunnel crack attacks and so on and so forth, but it's actually behind. I mean, you can read the article; it's well written, and it does actually correctly identify exactly what the issue is. The only thing that I find rather interesting is that this particular issue has always been there. So the issue is that generally, if you're creating a client to server, client to site, whatever it may be, VPN, you have to make a decision about what traffic goes down the VPN tunnel to, let's say, your corporate network, and what traffic goes around that tunnel because potentially you need access to local devices. So a good example of that is if you've got a network printer at home and you're VPN'd into your corporate network but need to print off something or other presentation or whatever it may be. If all your traffic was tunnels, you wouldn't be able to use your local printer. You'd be able to see printers back in the office, but that's not much use. So for as long as I can remember, a split tunneling approach appears to have been an option within VPN software. Now, what they're saying, I think, in this article is, well, okay, there are a couple of very specific um, scenarios where you can manipulate that to do things that you wouldn't expect. I mean, one of them would be if your VPN uses DNS to identify the VPN server, because generally the traffic to and from the client to the VPN server itself goes outside the tunnel rather than inside the tunnel. Although it doesn't actually have to. They're trying to avoid double encryption, but if you are bothered about security, the amount of overhead that double encryption applies, given the fact that modern CPUs are fast, there's plenty of memory, and bandwidth is relatively cheap these days. It's much less of an issue than it was a few years ago. But traffic to and from the actual VPN server itself tends to go outside the tunnel and therefore be potentially unencrypted, or at least sniffable by attackers on the network. So if you have the ability to manipulate DNS in, say, malicious cafe with free Wi-Fi, you could point the client to a server of your choice rather than the actual VPN server itself, and effectively, create a man in the middle type attack, whereby that traffic at least goes via the server of your control. You can do similar sorts of things around local networking. A really interesting one is if a malicious VPN server delivers a public IP address to the VPN client, that can be, under some circumstances, perceived as being the local network, therefore goes outside the tunnel. So these are not new. I mean, they're being tracked by new CVEs, specifically in certain, WireGuard and Claro VPN and so on and so forth. But the concepts have always been there. And I don't think that, I think those of us that have run VPNs since year dot are very well aware of the issues around split tunneling, and the requirement to understand what traffic actually does go through the tunnel and what traffic actually doesn't go through the tunnel. I mean, previously when I've worked in higher, well, I still do work in a high security environment, but where I've worked in environments that extensively used VPNs to access highly sensitive data, the split tunneling was simply turned off, and we did go to some trouble to test to see whether what traffic would go around the VPNs, and what traffic would go through the VPN if you forced all the traffic through the VPN. And some clients were better than others, but nothing leaked particularly significantly. And I suspect that maybe there has been some lazy coding going on in that they've identified in these particular vulnerabilities, or maybe it's just down to the fact that default configurations tend to be let's make it work rather than let's make it really, really secure. But yeah, just be aware of that. So if you are using VPNs, client-based VPNs, be certain that you understand what traffic is actually VPN'd and what traffic isn't, and be aware that there are ways to manipulate those rules to send traffic to devices that you would not necessarily expect. And then finally from me today, a little bit more information has come out about the electoral register breach that was disclosed earlier this week. It appears, through a little bit of research and reverse engineering by some researchers at TechCrunch, they've identified that it is most likely to be an exploit of an on-prem, unpatched Microsoft Exchange server that led to the initial breach. So, I mean, as we know, the breach was in place for a long time before it was detected, and the announcements came surprisingly late after that anyway. Still remains the fact that the data, as far as I can see, the data that's leaked, whilst you don't want this data leaked, obviously, is at least substantially already in the public domain, although difficult to pull together in one go, in one place at one time. So, moral of the story is Microsoft Exchange, on-prem Microsoft Exchange servers have had a very tough year. If you've got them, if you're running Exchange, please make sure it's patched and up to date. Potentially even think about having a specific pen test run against it, just to make sure that anything internet facing, any Exchange servers internet facing, are not vulnerable to any of these now well-known exploits with exploit code readily available. Um, yeah, so that is all from me for today. I hope you have a great Friday and a super weekend. I shall be back on Monday morning.